It Up quilt is an awesome opportunity to set order to all those different scraps you might have in your fabric stash. I use printed cottons as well as yarn dyes to have a mix of textures and prints, and I set order to them by creating an ombre effect of going from light to medium to dark all the way down the quilt. And the patchwork is so simple that it's perfectly approachable for a beginner, but the techniques that I use in arranging those colors and intensities is going to be fun for even the most advanced quilter. The materials for this quilt are pretty straightforward. You're just going to raid your stash for all sorts of beautiful fabrics. And as long as it's the size of a charm maybe, or even a little bigger, it's going to be perfect. And I love the idea of this style of quilt having all different kinds of prints. Maybe you can make one that has 0 repeats. So pull out all your favorites, but you do want a range of light, dark, and medium tones. And we're going to go more specifically how to sort those when we get to the cutting. You're also going to want some straight pins, your rotary cutter, ruler, and a cutting mat, and some tools for marking. And go ahead and get your pattern PDF downloaded for layout. This is one of my favorite parts of the quilting process, and that is just digging through my stash and deciding what's going to be included in the final quilt. And this process for me started with pulling lots and lots of fabrics. The end quilt is going to have an equal amount of yarn dyed materials and printed materials. So I have both in front of me. And not only do I have some kind of random cuts, fat quarters, half yards, I also have some charms, and I'll talk more about that sizing and cutting later. But for now, we're just going to categorize in 3 main groups of light, medium, and dark. And we're not going to worry too much about the subtleties within those. We'll pay attention to that more when we get to laying the quilt out. So I am just going to basically go through these charms of prints first and sort of categorize them into what I feel like makes them light, medium, or dark. This process should really actually have you ignoring color, whether something's blue, yellow, pink, black, and just looking at whether it's light or dark. This fabric is actually a great example of how a single fabric can fall into 2 different color categories, just depending on where it's cut. This one on the right, I would probably put in the medium categories because of all these tones. But the way it's cut here, there's so much in the dark area of that background that I'm going to move it over to the dark group. And again, some of them could probably land in one or another category between medium and dark. But when we go to finishing the quilt, you'll see that it is the relativity of whatever block is next to it that's going to make something light or dark. Continue sorting all of your prints into 3 categories, whether they're charms or something that you're still going to have to cut down later, like some of these larger cuts here. Just stack them all up. And now I'm also going to sort through these yarn dyes and put them in different categories as well. The first Turn It Up quilt that I made started with 6.5-inch squares, and also then 7-inch squares that once they were turned into a half square triangle became 6.5-inch. So that yielded a 72 by 90 quilt. Today I'm using the same number of squares, but I'm starting a little smaller because I wanted some of the cutting to be done for me. I'm using charms for those whole prints, and those are 5 inches. So now I'm going to be cutting my other fabrics, if they're printed, to either be 5 inches, or if they're the yarn dyes that are going to become half square triangles, I'm going to cut them at 5.5 inches. So when I do my cutting, I just layer up the fabrics, usually to maybe a 2, 3, or even sometimes 4 layer cake of fabric so that I'm cutting several at once. I've got my light stack over here that is not yet a 5 or 5.5 inch. And actually I have to cut all the yarn dyes together because the yarn dyes are going to be bigger. So I'm going to grab some of my medium toned fabrics as well, because these are the fabrics that are going to become half square triangles. So they have to start bigger. You can also press or pre-wash your fabrics if you'd like to. But I did not want to throw a bunch of little 5-inch squares into the washing machine, so I just decided to leave all of them unwashed. So I've got 3 layers here. I'm going to move these charms out of my way. The first thing that I'm going to do is just get a nice clean edge on the left over here. one common clean edge between all of the fabrics. Clear that out of the way. And now I can cut a rectangle that is 5.5 inches wide. And then I'm going to clear this out of my way. Again, I'm going to clean off an edge here at the bottom, but I want to make sure it's square. So I want to line just any of these lines up with the edge of the fabric and cut across. And now I can measure off that new clean edge, 5.5 inches tall as well, so that I'm creating squares. And 3 at a time, which is great. If you have a nice sharp blade, you could probably even accomplish 4, 5, maybe even 6 at a time. And I'm only going to cut a few of each fabric because I want a lot of variety in this quilt. Continue cutting all your yarn dies at 5.5 inches, and if you have prints that haven't been cut down to the charm size of 5 inches, you can cut your prints as well. The whole quilt is going to take 180 blocks, so cut 90 of the yarn dies at 5.5 inches and 90 prints at 5 inches. I'm going to show you the simple process of building a half square triangle from 2 5.5-inch squares, and those are our yarn dyed materials. I'm just going to layer them up right sides together. Make sure all 4 edges are nicely aligned, and use a straight edge to draw a diagonal line from one corner to the other. I'm using this brighter chalk pen to show up on the dark fabrics. If you have a light fabric, you can use a ballpoint pen or a pencil. Don't worry, this is not going to get seen. The next step is going to be to sew a 1/4 inch to one side of the line and then also a 1/4 inch to the other side of the line, all the way down from corner to corner through both materials. Before I get started on the patchwork, I'm going to show you some of the great features on this 9400. This machine comes with 3 different needle plates. Right now I have the zigzag plate on, but I'm going to switch to the straight stitch plate, which makes it really simple to sew your patchwork right from the edges because it prevents the materials from getting pushed down into the machine. And all I have to do is pop it up. And then slide the next one in. And now we're going to spin the fabric around and sew again a 1/4 inch to the left on the other side. So the next step is to cut with your rotary right on that marked line between the seams. So one of these pairs is going to create 2 same half square triangles in one step. So you'll want to press these with their seam allowances going one way or the other in the back. It doesn't make a difference. I normally press towards the darker fabric. We'll want to trim these down to be the same size as the printed charms, which is 5 inches. And you can see the difference between the 2 here. So we're going to use our rotary cutter and our clear quilting ruler to trim all these after they've been pressed. And that's how you make a half square triangle. Well, I have a lot of cutting, pressing, sewing, trimming, and marking behind me now, and it's time to build a beautiful quilt with these blocks. I have all my half square yarn dies, and I have my printed squares. Everything is trimmed to 5 inches. I have 30 in each of the categories. So in the light category, I have 30 prints, 30 half square triangles, and the same for medium and dark. I'm first going to concentrate on setting up the first 5 rows of this quilt. The whole quilt is made up of 15 rows, and really they're divided in thirds. We have 5 light rows, 5 medium rows, and 5 darker rows. And each of them is going to be built pretty much the same. So I'm going to set aside the mediums and the darks for now. And I'm just going to be looking at my quilt map here to help me begin the layout of all my lights. Don't worry too much about having every square exactly where you might want it in the end to begin with. It's just nice to go ahead and get all the rows laid out, alternating the prints and the half squares. And the first 5 rows are going to be made up of 4 that all go in one direction, and then the last one, the 5th one, is going to be headed in the other direction in terms of the half square triangle direction. So the quilt is also 12 blocks across. So again, I'm just not really thinking too hard about how I'm laying these out yet. I'm just putting them there. I'm gonna go this way. Once you've got everything laid out, you can start adjusting the position of each of them. So if I have a print here on all sides of it, you're gonna see a half square. See that? So they're basically, it's sort of a checkerboard between half squares and prints. And again, I'm probably going to be spacing out similar prints away from each other, but it's nice to just get a start. The other thing that you'll probably want to do once you have everything laid out is within that 5-row block, there is going to be some subtlety of light to dark. So you can start repositioning so that the kind of darker lights are down towards the bottom to further propel that brightest bright up at the top down to getting closer to medium tones. So just enjoy the process of laying everything out, and then have a good look at everything once you have to adjust the layout. So this 5th row here is going to head the other way. I'm going to turn all my half squares going the other direction now. I essentially have the top third of my quilt all laid out now. These are all 5 light rows. But to help push that smooth transition further along, I'm actually going to pull a couple of these last row of lights out and replace them with mediums. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the following row of medium. I'm going to pull a couple of the mediums out and replace them with lights. So that's going to help merge those tones closer together. So I'm just going to take out this guy and replace it with something just a little darker. Take plenty of time to think through all of these decisions once it's all laid out. Like any simple patchwork, to assemble all of these blocks together, you just start in rows. I usually start from left to right, pairing up 2, aligning their edges, sewing with a 1/4 inch seam allowance with right sides together. And then once you've done that, you can pick up the next guy in line heading towards the right until you have an entire row completely sewn. And do that with each row. Once all your rows are sewn, you can press the seam allowances in opposite directions, row by row, so that they nest well together when you sew those long passes. And once you've completed the whole light third of the quilt, you can do the exact same process of layout, switching around, building those transition rows with the medium and the dark section to complete your quilt. The Turn It Up quilt is a really intriguing exercise in analyzing your stash for shades from light all the way to dark. I'm thinking now about how I might machine quilt this, and I'm really sort of seduced by these zigzag turns that the quilt takes. So I'm thinking about doing some simple straight line quilting, and the AccuFeed system on the Janomes makes it so simple. It's really easy to customize a different size. You can increase or decrease the size of the squares, or you could just add or subtract rows and columns to get exactly what you want. It's almost a foolproof recipe for building a really beautiful quilt from fabrics you may already have on hand, but with really approachable